Welcome to another episode of My Weird Prompts, an AI-generated podcast featuring the random prompts of Daniel Rosehill as answered by a revolving cast of friendly AI characters. Join us for deep dives into AI, technology, and whatever other random thing Daniel finds fascinating today. Subscribe on Spotify or your favorite podcatcher. Now, today's episode.
This episode was generated using artificial intelligence. Please verify facts.
Hi there, Herman and Corn. We've had some very interesting episodes talking about mental health in the course of this podcast. I'm currently very much enjoying the episode about schizophrenia and the epidemiology of it, the incidence of it around the world. And you're mentioning the environmental factors that have come to light in more recent years that I was traditionally thought of as being a very stable prevalence, and it turns out that the environment there is some correlation between very specific and interesting environments actually. Fascinating, that one about the immigrant experience being associated, because I'm an immigrant, fortunately haven't had any brushes with psychosis, but I'm not making light of that causation, because there is a real issue here in Israel with a very, very tragically a rate of suicide among immigrants to Israel. And I'm sure the same dynamics can be pointed to with regard to, well, you mentioned being an outsider with psychosis, and I think just with suicide, we're looking more at just the stresses of immigrant life being significantly higher, more difficult maybe than not immigrating somewhere else in the world. So a really interesting one. It brings to mind, of course, another prompt, which is why I'm asking it. And we talked about personality disorders in another podcast. And I have to say, when learning about mental health is definitely something I've been curious about for a long time. They kind of fascinate me because they seem to sit in this kind of weird divide where you have, let's say, mood disorders like depression and anxiety. If we were to kind of if mental illness were an ice cream shop, these might be the vanilla. Very common, very treatable for the most part, and we can kind of understand there's a biological mechanism there, and there's effective drugs and there's effective therapy. So it's kind of a fairly, in the most case, again I say, in most, not all cases, but for most people it's a fairly clean cut one. Then you have personality disorders, and these really kind of stand out because when you think about things like sociopathy or narcissistic personality disorder or borderline personality disorder, you say, hang on, wait, is that like another type of mood disorder? Is there like a specific pill for that? And when I first learned that there isn't, and sometimes they have this very, very tragic feature whereby those who have them don't actually have the self-awareness to know that they are ill, and often this profound resistance to the mental health system and the mental health paradigm. So even if a family member tries desperately to get them in the door of any kind of mental health setting, they're so profoundly resistant and so profoundly in denial that they'll just react with anger. So my question, Herman and Corn, we talked about these illnesses before and how mysterious they are. My question is regarding the environmental factors that you mention here. I'm intrigued as to how these just seem to emerge, because I've come across a couple of really sad stories from friends and friends of friends, and the people one brushes into in life, in which a seemingly normal, healthy family with everything stable and hunky-dory to the extent that it can be, you have this person suddenly who just comes into that family tree and they have this profound personality disorder, and they're often kind of, sadly, the black sheep of the family, in, I guess, maybe less compassionate family systems, ostracized, or just kind of looked upon as a curiosity. And it always makes me wonder, how did that happen? What do we know about the emergence of personality disorders? We've talked about childhood trauma, and I've heard, but I always emphasize when I say I've heard something, because I say these things knowing that they may be untrue, that there is some association between especially narcissistic personality disorder, people who grew up feeling ignored or something by their parents. It always felt a little bit simplistic to me, that concept, and I'm very wary. I think that these conditions, from what I gather, they're not that well understood yet, but there is some understanding emerging. So Herman and Corn, let's talk about personality disorders. There are different clusters of them, some more famous than others. And what do we know so far, not only about their mechanism of action, how is it that a brain has such a disordered personality, but what do we know about why they emerge in the first place? Is there any clues in their epidemiology as to why they emerge? Over to you two.
Hey everyone, welcome back to my weird prompts. I am Corn, and I am joined as always by my brother,
Herman Poppleberry, reporting for duty. We have a heavy one today, Corn. Our housemate Daniel sent over a prompt that really digs into the architecture of the human soul, or at least the ways that architecture can sometimes be built on a bit of a shaky foundation.
It is a fascinating topic. Daniel was listening to our recent episode on schizophrenia and the epidemiology of mental illness, and it got him thinking about personality disorders. He mentioned that if mental illness were an ice cream shop, things like depression and anxiety are the vanilla and chocolate. They are common, we have a pretty good handle on the biological mechanisms, and we have a wide range of effective treatments. But personality disorders, those are the exotic, complicated flavors that we are still trying to map out.
I love that analogy, though it is a bit bittersweet because those exotic flavors often come with a lot of pain for the person experiencing them and for the people around them. Daniel asked specifically about the emergence and epidemiology of these disorders. How does a brain develop a disordered personality? What are the environmental triggers, like childhood trauma? And why do some people seem to become the black sheep of an otherwise stable family?
It is a profound question because it touches on the very core of who we are. When we talk about a mood disorder, we are talking about a state of being. You are in a depressed state. But when we talk about a personality disorder, we are talking about the traits that define how you interact with the entire world. It is not just a cloud passing over the sun. It is the way the landscape itself is shaped.
Exactly. In clinical terms, we are moving from axis 1 to axis 2 if we are using the older diagnostic and statistical manual framework. Personality disorders are defined as enduring patterns of inner experience and behavior that deviate markedly from the expectations of the individual's culture. They are pervasive, they are inflexible, and they usually have an onset in adolescence or early adulthood.
So, Herman, let us start with the big picture. When we look at the epidemiology, how common are these disorders? Because I think people might be surprised by the numbers.
You are right. Most people think of personality disorders as these rare dramatic conditions you only see in movies, like the classic Hollywood sociopath, but the reality is much more common. Large-scale studies, like the National Epidemiologic Survey on Alcohol and Related Conditions, suggest that about 9% of adults in the United States meet the criteria for at least one personality disorder. Some studies even put that number as high as 15% depending on the population being surveyed.
9 to 15%. That is 1 in 10 people, roughly. That is massive. If you are on a crowded bus in Jerusalem, several people around you might be navigating these challenges.
Precisely. And they are grouped into 3 clusters. Cluster A is the odd or eccentric group like paranoid or schizoid personality disorders. Cluster B is the dramatic, emotional, or erratic group. This includes the ones people hear about most: narcissistic, borderline, antisocial, and histrionic. Then Cluster C is the anxious or fearful group, like avoidant or dependent personality disorders.
Daniel specifically mentioned narcissistic and borderline, which fall into Cluster B. There is a lot of public discourse around these lately, sometimes used as insults rather than clinical terms. But I want to get into the mechanism of action that Daniel asked about. How does the brain actually develop this way? Is it something you were born with, or is it something that happens to you?
It is the ultimate nature versus nurture, cocktail, Corn. We have to look at the neurobiology first. If you look at neuroimaging studies of people with borderline personality disorder, for example, you often see a hyperactive amygdala. That is the brain's alarm system. It is the part that processes fear and emotional significance. At the same time, you often see reduced activity or volume in the prefrontal cortex, specifically the anterior cingulate cortex.
So the brakes are weak, and the gas pedal is stuck to the floor.
That is a perfect way to put it. The prefrontal cortex is supposed to regulate those emotional surges from the amygdala. In a disordered personality, that feedback loop is broken or poorly calibrated. When a person with borderline personality disorder feels a slight rejection, their amygdala screams that it is a life-threatening catastrophe, and their prefrontal cortex doesn't have the strength to say, hey, calm down, it was just a missed text message.
But what causes that calibration error? Is it genetic?
Genetics play a huge role. Heritability estimates for personality disorders generally range from 40 to 60%. For borderline specifically, it is around 46%. For antisocial personality disorder, it can be even higher. So, you might be born with a certain temperament. You might be born with an emotionally vulnerable nervous system. You are just more sensitive to stimuli from day one.
Okay, so you have this biological vulnerability. But that is only half the story. Daniel asked about the environmental factors, specifically childhood trauma. How does the environment take that biological spark and turn it into a full-blown disorder?
This is where the biosocial theory comes in, pioneered by Marcia Linehan. It suggests that a personality disorder emerges when a biologically vulnerable child is placed in an invalidating environment. An invalidating environment is one where the child's emotional responses are punished, ignored, or trivialized.
Give me a concrete example of that. What does that look like in a household?
Imagine a child who is naturally very sensitive. They fall down and scrape their knee, and they cry more intensely than another child might. An invalidating parent might say, "Stop being a baby, it doesn't even hurt, you were just doing this for attention." To the child, the pain is very real, but the person they rely on for reality testing is telling them their internal experience is wrong.
So they stop trusting their own emotions.
Exactly. Or even worse, they learn that they have to escalate their emotional expression to get any response at all. If a quiet sob gets ignored, maybe a screaming fit gets a reaction. Over time, this prevents the child from learning how to regulate their emotions. They never develop the internal tools to self-soothe because their environment never modeled it for them and never validated their attempts.
That makes a lot of sense for borderline personality disorder. But what about narcissistic personality disorder? Daniel mentioned the idea of a child feeling ignored by their parents. Is it always neglect, or can it be the opposite?
It can absolutely be the opposite. With narcissism, we often see two paths. One is indeed neglect or coldness, where the child develops a grandiose shell to protect a very fragile, empty core. But the other path is what we call overvaluation. This is the parent who tells the child they are a perfect genius who can do no wrong, while simultaneously failing to see the child's actual needs or personality. The child becomes an extension of the parent's ego.
So in both cases, the child isn't being seen for who they actually are. They are either a burden or a trophy.
Spot on. And that leads to a disordered sense of self. If you are never seen as a whole, flawed human person, you don't know how to be one. You either feel like nothing, or you feel like you have to be everything to be worthy of existing.
I want to touch on something Daniel mentioned that I found really poignant. He talked about the black sheep of the family. He has seen cases where a family seems perfectly normal and healthy, and yet one sibling develops a profound personality disorder while the others are fine. How does that happen? It feels so unfair to the parents who feel like they did everything right.
It is incredibly tough, and we have to be careful not to blame parents entirely. Sometimes the fit between a parent's style and a child's temperament is just wrong. We call this goodness of fit. A parent might be perfectly capable of raising two children who have easygoing temperaments, but then the third child is born with that high emotional vulnerability we talked about. That same parenting style that worked for the first two might be unintentionally invalidating for the third.
So it is not that the parents are bad. It is that the specific needs of that one child were different, and the mismatch created a rift.
Right? And then you get these cascading effects. The child acts out because they are struggling. The parents react with frustration or withdrawal because they don't understand why this child is so difficult compared to the others. The child feels that withdrawal as further evidence that they are unlovable or broken. It becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. The child becomes the black sheep because the family system doesn't know how to integrate their specific brand of suffering.
It is a tragic cycle. And then Daniel mentioned that these individuals often have a lack of self-awareness. They don't know they are ill. In clinical terms, we call this being ego-syntonic, right?
Yes. This is one of the biggest differences between a mood disorder and a personality disorder. If you have a panic attack, it is ego-dystonic. You know something is wrong. You don't like the feeling. You want it to stop. It feels like an outside force attacking you. But if you have a personality disorder, your behaviors and thoughts feel like just who you are. If you are paranoid, you don't think you have a disorder. You think everyone else is actually out to get you. The problem is the world, not you.
That must make treatment incredibly difficult. If the patient doesn't think there is a problem, why would they stay in therapy?
It is the primary challenge in the field. Many people with personality disorders only end up in treatment because of a crisis, like a suicide attempt, a legal issue, or a partner threatening to leave, and even then the dropout rates are very high. They often feel that the therapist is just another person who doesn't understand them or is trying to control them.
But we have made progress, haven't we? I remember reading about dialectical behavior therapy.
We have made massive strides. Dialectical Behavior Therapy, or DBT, was specifically designed for borderline personality disorder. It focuses on the balance between acceptance and change. It teaches concrete skills for mindfulness, distress tolerance, and emotional regulation. Before DBT, borderline was often considered untreatable. Now, we know that with intensive work, many people can actually go into remission. They can reach a point where they no longer meet the diagnostic criteria.
That is an amazing thought. The personality itself can actually shift, or at least the way it expresses itself can be managed.
It is more about building a life worth living, as Linehan puts it. You might always be a more sensitive person. Your amygdala might always be a bit loud. But you can learn how to drive the car anyway without crashing it every time you feel a bump in the road.
I want to go back to the epidemiology for a second. We talked about the prevalence in the general population. But what about the gender split? Because there are some interesting biases there, aren't there?
Oh, there are huge biases. Traditionally, borderline personality disorder was thought to be much more common in women, while antisocial personality disorder was thought to be the domain of men. But more recent research suggests the gap might not be as wide as we thought. It might be a matter of how the symptoms are expressed and how clinicians perceive them.
So a man who is emotionally volatile might be labeled as having intermittent explosive disorder, or just being a jerk, while a woman doing the same thing gets the borderline label.
Exactly. And a woman who is cold and calculating might be seen as having a different issue, while a man is labeled antisocial. There is a lot of work being done to move toward a more dimensional model of personality, rather than these rigid categories. The latest version of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, the DSM-5, actually included an alternative model that looks at things like identity, self-direction, empathy, and intimacy as scales rather than just checkboxes.
That feels much more human. We are all on these scales somewhere. It is just that for some people, the settings are dialed to an extreme that causes significant impairment.
Right. And speaking of impairment, we should talk about the second-order effects Daniel alluded to, the impact on the community and the family. Personality disorders are associated with high rates of unemployment, homelessness, and substance abuse. People with antisocial personality disorder make up a huge percentage of the prison population. The economic cost is in the hundreds of billions of dollars annually.
And the human costs to the families. Being the sibling or the parent of someone with a severe personality disorder can be traumatizing in its own right. You spend your life walking on eggshells, never knowing which version of the person you are going to get.
There is actually a term for that. Walking on Eggshells is the title of a very famous book for family members of people with borderline personality disorder. It highlights the chronic stress of living with someone whose reality can shift in an instant. It can lead to what we call secondary traumatization.
It makes me think about the immigrant experience Daniel mentioned in his prompt. He talked about the high rates of psychosis and suicide among immigrants here in Israel. Does that intersect with personality disorders too?
It certainly does. If you are already biologically vulnerable, the massive stress of migration, the loss of social support, and the experience of being an outsider can be the ultimate environmental trigger. If you are struggling with your sense of identity and you move to a country where you don't speak the language and don't understand the culture, your identity can completely fracture.
It is like the ultimate invalidating environment. The entire society is telling you that your ways of being and communicating are wrong or irrelevant.
Precisely. We see higher rates of paranoid ideation in immigrant populations, which makes sense. If the world actually is confusing and somewhat hostile to you, your brain is going to lean into those paranoid traits to try to protect you.
So, Herman, what can we actually do with this information? For the people listening who might recognize themselves or a loved one in these descriptions, what are the practical takeaways?
The first thing is to realize that these are not moral failings. Having a personality disorder doesn't make you a bad person. It means you have a brain that was wired for survival in an environment that didn't provide what you needed, or your biology was just set to high sensitivity mode. Understanding the mechanism can take some of the shame out of it.
And for the families? For the people who feel like they're the ones suffering because of someone else's disorder?
Boundaries. That is the most important word. You cannot fix a personality disorder for someone else. You can only control your own reactions and set firm limits on what you will tolerate. There are support groups like NAMI, the National Alliance on Mental Illness, that have specific programs for families dealing with this. You are not alone, and you didn't cause it.
I think that is a really important point. The black sheep dynamic often thrives on guilt. The parents feel guilty, the siblings feel guilty, and the person with the disorder uses that guilt as a tool, often unconsciously. Breaking that cycle requires realizing that the disorder is a medical condition, not a choice.
Exactly. And if you are the one struggling, seek out specialized help. General talk therapy can sometimes be unhelpful or even triggering for people with personality disorders. You want someone trained in DBT, or schema therapy, or mentalization-based treatment. These are therapies specifically designed to help with the core issues of identity and regulation.
It is amazing that we have these tools now. Even 20 years ago, the outlook was much bleaker.
It really was. We are living in a bit of a golden age for personality research. We are starting to understand the epigenetics of it. How early life experiences can actually turn certain genes on or off, affecting how our brain processes stress for the rest of our lives. It sounds scary, but it also means we might find ways to intervene even earlier.
Imagine a world where we can identify at-risk children and provide their parents with the specific tools needed to prevent the disorder from ever fully emerging. That would be a game changer.
It would be revolutionary. Instead of trying to fix a foundation that has already hardened, we would be helping to pour it correctly in the first place.
Well, this has been a deep dive, Herman. I feel like I understand that ice cream shop a bit better now, even if some of the flavors are still a bit mysterious.
It is a lot to process, but I think the more we talk about these things openly, the less power the stigma has. These are human beings, not just diagnoses.
Absolutely. And hey, if you have been listening for a while and find these deep dives helpful, we would really appreciate it if you could leave a quick review on your podcast app or on Spotify. It genuinely helps the show reach more people who might be looking for this kind of information.
It really does. We see every review, and it means a lot to us. So, thank you to Daniel for sending in such a thoughtful prompt. It gave us a chance to explore a corner of the human experience that doesn't get enough nuanced discussion.
Definitely. We live in a house full of curious minds, and Daniel is always pushing us to go deeper. If you want to get in touch with us or see our past episodes, you can find everything at myweirdprompts.com. We add the full RSS feed there, and a contact form if you want to send us your own weird prompts.
We are also on Spotify, so make sure to follow us there to get the latest episodes as soon as they drop.
Thanks for joining us today. This has been My Weird Prompts.
Until next time, keep asking the hard questions.
Goodbye, everyone.
Bye.
You know, Herman, thinking about the biology of this again, I'm struck by how much of our personality is really just our brain's best guess at how to stay safe.
That's a profound way to look at it, Corn. Whether it's narcissism or borderline traits, they often start as protective mechanisms. A child who isn't seen develops a big personality to be noticed. A child who is hurt develops a hypervigilance to never be hurt again.
It's like an immune system for the ego. Sometimes it overreacts and starts attacking the person it's supposed to protect.
Exactly. An autoimmune disorder of the personality. And just like with medical autoimmune issues, you can't just tell the person to stop it. You have to treat the underlying system.
I'm curious about the historical context here. When did we first start recognizing these as distinct from other mental illnesses?
It goes back quite a way, but not in the form we know now. In the early 19th century, a French psychiatrist named Philippe Pinel talked about manie sans délire, or mania without delusion. He noticed people who were incredibly impulsive and even violent, but didn't have any hallucinations or loss of contact with reality. Their intellect was intact, but their character was broken.
That sounds like the early description of antisocial personality disorder.
Precisely. Then in the early 20th century, we had the concept of the psychopathic inferiority. It wasn't until the mid-20th century that we really started to categorize these into the clusters we use today. The term borderline itself came from the idea that these patients were on the border between neurosis and psychosis.
They weren't quite disconnected from reality, but they weren't exactly stable either.
Right. They lived in that middle ground. It's fascinating how our language has evolved to try to capture these nuances. We used to use words like character disorder, which feels much more judgmental than personality disorder.
Character sounds like a moral choice. Personality sounds like a psychological structure.
Exactly. And that shift in language reflects our growing understanding of the neurobiology. We are moving away from blame and toward understanding.
I wonder what the next 50 years will bring. With the advancements in neural mapping and genetic editing, will the concept of a personality disorder even exist in 2075?
That's a massive question. We might move entirely to a functional model. Instead of saying you have narcissistic personality disorder, we might say you have a specific deficiency in the empathy circuitry of your right supramarginal gyrus, coupled with an overactive reward system in the ventral striatum.
It becomes an engineering problem rather than a character study.
In some ways, that's more hopeful. But I hope we don't lose the human element. Even if we can map the neurons, the experience of living as that person is still a story. And stories need listeners.
That's a great point. Science can tell us the how, but we still need each other to navigate the why.
Well said, brother. I think that's a good place to wrap it up.
Agreed. Thanks again for the deep dive, Herman, and thanks to everyone for listening.
Catch you on the next one.
This has been My Weird Prompts. We will be back soon with more explorations into the strange and wonderful world of human behavior.
See ya.
Take care, everyone.
Goodbye.
And don't forget to check out the website at myweirdprompts.com. We've got a lot of cool stuff over there.
Including the back catalog. All 521 episodes now.
It's a lot of talking, isn't it?
We've got a lot to say.
Fair enough. All right. Truly signing off now.
Bye.
Goodbye.
This episode was generated using Gemini Flash 3. Text-to-speech engine was Chatterbox Turbo.
Thanks for listening to another episode of My Weird Prompts, an AI-generated podcast featuring Daniel Rosehill's AI prompts as answered by a revolving cast of friendly AI characters including me, Cornelius the Sloth. Subscribe on Spotify or visit myweirdprompts.com.